Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining myself and Sally this lunchtime to talk to you about Don't Leave Me This Way. Sally and I are in two different locations today. We're hoping that the technology is going to work and get us through the next half an hour. Sally will introduce herself in a moment. So just bear with us. If there's any latency in the slides loading up, it is because there has been, unsurprisingly, an increased demand on webinars at the moment, but we will persevere. The webinar is being recorded, so for anyone that isn't able to join us or drops out because of calls or family demands, not to worry, you will get a copy of the recording on our website and via Sally's SYLO Associates. So without further ado, let's introduce ourselves. So Sally.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly. So I'm one of the founding directors of a HR consultancy called SYLO Associates, and we provide a range of support from advice through to training. And this must now be, is it our fourth webinar that we've co-hosted, Kelly?
It is indeed, but just see, before we go ahead, I've got people that have got no sound, so I'm just trying to work out what's going. So I'm just trying to work out what's going on.
You can hear me though, can't you, Kelly?
I can hear you. Okay, so can everyone just check their microphones to make sure that they are okay? Because I've got some people that can hear us and that some people can't. So okay, I'm just trying to see if there are any other options to work with here. So I apologize for maybe, yeah, if people can, let me see, log in and log back out again. So right, so sorry, Sally.
That's okay.
Continue with, yes, we've worked together 4 times and hey, we're expecting some technical challenges. So sorry, I interrupted you.
Yes, so as a HR consultancy, we deal with all aspects of HR and your employees and how you deal with data around employees, which is why we've worked closely with Data Basics on these webinars.
And I'm Kelly Peters. I'm the other co-founder of Data Basics, and as Sally said, this is the 4th time that we have done this section. We are recording the webinar. It will be made available to everybody who can't hear us, because you will get the sound through the recording. So I'm going to continue with the slides. And let Sally talk about the first slide, which is about the employment life cycle.
So the purpose of the webinar is to actually think about what you do as an organisation and business when people leave, and just think it's quite important to just see it as part of a continuum process where you've taken them on board. We know from dealing with companies, you very much focus on that beginning part of the journey, starter forms and getting people's details when they join you, but it's just as important when they're leaving you. And perhaps, you know, in the challenging times that we've got now, actually it's making sure that there are some really key processes in place as well, where maybe you've got working from home, so there isn't the same connectivity that you might have when everybody's in the office. So the focus of this session is that last part of that life cycle when people are leaving you and your organisation. Yeah.
Thanks, Sally. And we're very mindful that when Sally and I developed this this session, because it's been both a workshop and a webinar, the coronavirus wasn't a thing. So we are mindful that we are dealing with a continued and different situation. So we are going to factor in some advice in around coronavirus and the impact it will have on your workforce, in particular if you are in a situation where your workforce may be being reduced. So what we're looking at predominantly is how to, in that last moments of when someone resigns from the organisation, how you manage that process, both ensuring that you adhere to from an employment perspective, but also you don't put yourself at risk from a data protection perspective. And I think we have to be mindful that at the moment people are feeling incredibly anxious. There's a lot of uncertainty. They may be feeling overwhelmed. And what we have to be mindful of, if you are reducing the workforce because of the current situation, people may become a little disgruntled, and we need to be mindful of that and any disruption that could be caused to your business in relation to staff leaving. What we wanted to, I kind of ask everybody that's on the webinar really, is before we kick into it, we were really interested to know if you had any processes that you follow when it comes to managing employees leaving the premises. So it'd be super useful for you to use the chat box to say to Sally and I, you know, you don't have to go into great detail, but, you know, do you have policies, processes? Oh, nice. So we do have someone that has a leavers checklist, which is amazing. Do others have anything similar, or do you have HR policies that you can refer to that would help you guide you through this process? I can see some people typing, which is always useful. And it's not to worry if you don't, because obviously part of today's session is to talk you through that process. So good. Okay. So what we might find is that when we're talking about our checklist and what we suggest, I would be really interested to see if there are anything that you think we're missing that you would advocate adding, because, hey, we can learn as much as providing some advice and guidance. Okay, so the other point that we got here is that, you know, people seem to have a checklist, but maybe it's the handling equipment that could be a little bit of a challenge. So that leads quite nicely onto the employee exit timeline, which Sally's going to talk about, and then I'll briefly talk about data protection elements afterwards. Sally.
Okay, so in a normal situation, when somebody hands in their resignation notice, this is the sort of timeline and things that typically happen. So any of you that have a checklist, it might be worth thinking and reflecting on some of these areas, just the level of detail that you cover. So somebody will resign and you'll accept their resignation and make sure that they get paid. But really what's important is what's in somebody's contract around competition, data protection, confidentiality. And if, you know, that is something that's so key, you know, what are they going to do with your information after they leave? And the rest of the timeline is effectively then about, right, I want you to return the credit card, the property, and all of that gets evidenced. But at the heart of this, I think where I'd be sort of getting people to think about are sort of systems in place for helping to record that information centrally wherever possible. And then maybe that avoids the handling of equipment becoming slightly chaotic, because everybody would be able to know in that central place what has been returned and how. I don't know for those people on the webinar if you've got a HR system, but if you do, that's a really good place for recording that sort of information, and also making sure that data gets archived appropriately, you know, in terms of retention of records. So that is a normal an exit timeline if somebody were resigning. Now we're in a different space now currently with people working from home, and I think that's why I sort of signposted there the use of systems being really key in all of this. But also, you know, you've got an infrastructure, but people are properly connected on a personal basis, so that people are talking and communicating, so they feel that they're part of a team. And then I think these processes, both from people might be leaving you, but also join. You know, if there are people join, it's really important that you have that in place. So I think, you know, you're probably testing some of those systems now because of challenges, but if you don't have a HR system, it's certainly an area to consider, because, you know, a cloud-based system could be accessed from wherever you are, and people being able to update their own information in terms of change of address and those sorts of things. So that's me, Kelly. I think it's just really just signposting those key parts of that timeline.
And I think for me, like us at Data Basics, we are now working remotely. There may be situations where your staff have taken essential information home with them to be able to continue their work. I suppose it's just about being mindful that if decisions have to be made that affect the workforce, do you know what information is now outside of the office domain that's now sitting in people's homes? Being mindful of that and knowing where your information is and what your staff have access to whilst they are working from home or working their notice, and they're working their notice whilst they're at home. What is the process that you're going to have in place to make sure that they hand back the equipment and the paperwork and stuff in this really kind of challenging environment that we're currently faced with? So for me, I think there are a number of data protection risks when it comes to staff leaving a business in you know, if this was a month ago, I would have been saying that actually one of the challenges you have is you've either got staff that are leaving that are career progression, or they've made a decision to change their career, and it's an easy transition out of the business. You've then got staff that you are potentially negotiating with about their access, about their exit, because they're either unhappy or there are ongoing HR related issues that you are dealing with. Now, it is those disgruntled employees, which we may see more of now because of the current situation, is how do we make sure that we don't create any unnecessary data protection issues? And I think what is a really good example is the Morrison's case, which we've talked about in several webinars, is that Morrison's as an organisation had a breach because of a very unhappy member of staff downloaded information and published that not only to newspapers, but published 100,000 people's payroll information online. Now, the Information Commissioner said that the company as a whole did everything they could have done to protect the information. The challenge that's being given and going through the courts at the moment is that the court are being challenged by individuals that they didn't think their data was being protected. So what we need to be thinking about is when we have, or when we're aware that we have unhappy members of staff, is how are we managing access to information without affecting their rights and their freedoms as an individual in that transition period, and be mindful that they could do something that could negatively affect you as a business, such as downloading information or making sharing information on inappropriate platforms and whatnot. So I think it's about making sure we can manage that appropriately. So I'd be interested in terms of hearing from people what you think are the data protection risks when people are leaving the business. Obviously, I've talked about, downloading information they don't have the right to download, sharing it with people that they shouldn't be sharing it with. When we did the workshop, we had an example where people just don't hand back equipment. I'd be interested if there are examples or from those listening. What do you think are the other risks that could be facing you as an employer? And I don't know, Sally, if there's anything that you would add.
There is. I mean, under the regulations, people can now ask for subject access requests. So it's a less of, this is more about people thinking about what they put in emails and how they communicate, and that it remains appropriate. So when you're dealing with challenging situations, sometimes we can put things in emails that may not be appropriate. And I think this is still going to be an issue, and maybe I mean, we're still seeing organisations handling grievances even this week, and they'll still be having to follow a process. And we're still very closely advising managers and people to think about what they're saying, because at a later date, somebody could then ask, well, I want a subject access request and to see all information that you hold on file. So this is more about what you're actually doing, not just what people are doing with your information. So I would very much still remind people of the need to think about that.
I think that's a good point. And I think we might see a surge of access requests from individuals who are feeling rather uncertain at the moment and wanting to know what organisations hold.
Yeah. And I'm looking here at one of the comments someone's made about removing access to online platforms. That's a really interesting point, isn't it? You know, the way in which people communicate externally on platforms can really have a damaging effect on the brand and on the company. So, you know, there is a need to either have policies in place that are very clear about expectations when behaving on those platforms, but also, you know, a need for training or communicating expectations, and then taking action, as somebody's just said, you know, maybe needing to remove access to those platforms if needs be. Yes.
So for me, I pulled together what I think should be on your to-do list, and I'd be interested to see if there's anything else that you would add from those that are listening to the webinar. So as we've already said, it is about making sure that you revoke access to email. Now, some people do this after an individual has actually left the building. Some people start doing this, you know, slightly before they've left, but it's about making sure that you have stopped that access to the email, so that once they are no longer an employee, they can no longer access the email system that you have. You may wish to make sure that if there are people that are taking over the role, or are or in a handover, or are they are managing access to that individual's account once they've left, is that you set up auto forwarding, because not everybody's going to know that that individual has left the building. So make sure that the appropriate auto forwarding has been set up within the business, and that you're in control of that auto forwarding. You want to make sure that where you can, you want to take back all company devices. And as I've said, at the moment, where the vast majority of organisations are making decisions about working from home, how do you make sure that you have the devices that the individual has, that are company devices, can be handed back to you? So apart from having potentially a list of all the data that you process, do you have an actual physical asset register of computers and mobile phones that you have allocated to staff, that you can record that you've received that information back? You then really want to be thinking about revoking access to systems. And again, it's about being mindful of what systems the individual has access to already. And as Sally has said, we're now moving to more online cloud-based solutions. So do you know all the systems that that individual could have access to? And I'd also be wanting to be thinking about things such as WhatsApp groups, which we've also got on this slide, is that, you know, you want to make sure that access has been removed for that individual. So make sure you know the systems that the individual has access to, and then ensure that you have removed the appropriate permissions. And again, where you're using the likes of WhatsApp groups, or you're using Facebook Messenger, for example, or other tools as a communication method, who's in control of that group? How can you make sure that that person's mobile phone has been removed from that group, so that information, once they've left, is no longer being shared? with them from a business perspective. You want to make sure, because obviously we're talking about electronic, but individuals may have paper records. So as I've said, at the moment, you may have taken paper records home with you. And if you're in that process of leaving a company and you've still got papers, you want to make sure that those records come back to you appropriately. Or you want an assurance that they have been securely shredded.
Mm.
You want to make sure that you get key fobs, passes, whatever it is, access to your buildings, that you get them back and that they no longer have physical access to your premises. If you use things like PIN codes, I would change the PIN code for the building. I know that might be a little bit frustrating, but the reality is that the regulation asks for you to put technical and organizational measures in place, and that would involve making sure that access codes are changed. If you have shared login and password that are necessary for, I would make sure that you change the shared password. And then I would ask them to confirm if you ask your staff to use personal devices for work purposes. I would want assurances in writing that that information has been removed. Why is that important? Well, this week, a military laptop was sold on eBay, German military laptop, and it had highly confidential classified information. They bought the laptop for $100. So we want that, and I'd want the reassurance that someone had done their job and removed it, because if they have given you that assurance, the liability lays with them, not necessarily with you. Not giving them that advice, you are liable for the fact that devices have been sold online with potentially highly sensitive information. So I'd be interested, is there anything that's on your leavers lists that we haven't covered that you are happy to share with the webinar? I'd be interested to know. Sally, is there anything that you would add whilst we're waiting for comments?
There is, actually. I think we might find that that some people they'll be working from home, which you've touched upon already, Kelly. So what are the arrangements going to be, and perhaps a more granular detail about getting some of this information back or equipment back. But for those people who might be on garden leave, so where people are exiting because of the commercial challenges within businesses, I think very sensitively think about that. Because garden leave is about giving people the ability to perhaps continue to do some project work, but you might be limiting them access to client areas. So I think you're going to have a level of things on your to-do list there, which are, well, we continue to give them access to this part of the organisation, but not this. And you'll want to make sure that they perhaps feel engaged, because financially you're setting up garden leave to help them before they leave because of what's going on in the economy. But then, so if you just were to switch everything off, then they wouldn't be able to do that. So I'd just be saying to organisations, just think very carefully what it is they're going to need to do if they're in that situation for you at work.
Excellent.
And yes, a point there. Somebody has said about the confidentiality agreement. So that was on the exit timeline. It is absolutely a reminder of how people treat your data, and that confidentiality is so key. So thank you.
Brilliant. And I would say the other thing I'm really interested from the group is in the world that we're living in, who else is involved in that exit of a staff member? Obviously, Sally and I, data protection and HR, what other teams or what other roles do you involve in that process when someone is leaving the organisation? So we've got line managers, for sure. Who else would you typically involve in that department? Yeah, and we've got IT department. So we've got line managers, HR, IT, someone who's responsible for data protection, possibly. Just throw that in there. it goes to show that actually it's useful. But have you considered who's responsible for your systems? So if you've got an outsourced system provider, so for example, Xero for your payroll that they have access to get their payroll slips from, who manages that? Is that you, or is that your outsourced provider? So just be mindful that there is going to be more than one person involved in this transition of someone leaving the business, and the access and permissions that are going to have to be removed. So I'm going to hand over to Sally, who's going to give some top tips.
Okay, so to make sure that you're covering everything that we would suggest that you do, it goes to the heart of making sure you've got the GDPR policies in place and that they're really communicated and understood. So I've said here lived. You know, people would understand if there was a breach of confidential information, who it is that they would go to handle and mitigate that within the organisation. And the same is true of any of your HR documents, so that they're up to date. So your contracts, policies and processes. From the 1st of April, all new starters need to have a contract on their first day. So that will place a bigger onus on organisations to make sure that those things are in place. The HR system I talked about earlier, I think it's a really sensible place to think about what you've got, because it can cover off your compliance in terms of HR information, but also GDPR compliance. And systems that we support have also got self-serve functionality, so people can go in and update their own records. So, for example, when they're leaving, you know where their P45 needed to be sent to. From a retention perspective, you know, if, for instance, you wanted to contact them after they'd left, you'd know how to do that. And then the system can also auto-archive documents. So it really takes the work away from how you handle your people data. So I can really recommend you having a look at what systems you've got in place. And then finally, I've got role model behaviours. So the importance of people and data will very much come from the top, and how the senior team and the leadership really consider how important it is that you treat your data sensitively and that people are respected, and all of the things that you would expect within an organisation that values its team. I have to say, organisations that place an importance on communication and their people will then probably equally be thinking about how they cover off their compliance. And I think the two things are very much hand in hand. So that's top tips that I would share, you know, and just some very quick wins in terms of having a HR system, and having documents that are up to date, so that when people are leaving, you can be confident that your confidentiality agreement, for example, is legally compliant and will cover everything that you need it to. There you go, Kelly.
Fabulous. So I think that leads very nicely onto the fact that your people are your brand. You know, it's about making sure that during this whole process, in accordance with your policies, and your people feel that they've been treated fairly as part of this, because even when they leave, they will still refer to your company. So it's about being mindful of that. The regulation is a framework. It really much allows you to be competitive. So if you can demonstrate that you have all the policies and practices in place, whether it be onboarding staff, manage them whilst they're an employee, and exiting them, you're in a strong position to show that you are accountable as an employer, and that your staff know how their information is used throughout their the life cycle that Sally talked about very early on. So that quite nicely leads us on to general questions that you may have before we talk about any other events that we are going to be hosting. So here's your opportunity to ask us any questions. For anyone that listens to the webinar after, in terms of the recording, feel free to contact Sally or me with your questions. We are happy to help them. So we have a question, which is one of our listeners has a system that they are using to store data. Others would like HR to be added to with restricted access, but obviously there's a bit of wariness that it's not been specifically designed for HR. I think that's a very good concern. Would it be safe to use them? I think I'll talk about from a data protection perspective, and then Sally can add her views from a HR perspective. From a data protection perspective, you'd want to be considering a data protection impact assessment. You'd want to make sure that if they are going to collect HR information, how are they going to protect the information? How are they going to restrict access to it? How does it support individual rights? How does it support the principles of regulation in terms of accuracy, retention? And that then helps you make a decision as to whether or not that is the right system for you, because it's been a balanced assessment. And if it comes out as actually this is not, and that provider can't make the necessary changes to reassure you, I would personally, I would not use that system for HR.
Yes, I mean, that was my point. I've tended to always, from a HR system perspective, find a system that's been purpose built for that purpose, because automatically it covers off a lot of the impact assessment things that Kelly was just talking about, because you have to have a legal basis for data that you hold. You will have a legal basis for giving access to certain data to the HR team if it's a HR system, but will you be able to justify that level of access to something that's not been designed for that purpose? And in your policies around privacy, it may be that equally could be at odds with what you're suggesting there as well. So the person who's raised that question, I'd be interested to see, perhaps look back to your data privacy policy and see whether or not that would cause you an issue as well.
That's a good point. Do we have any other questions? Cool.
Great.
So what we'll do is, if you are still thinking about some questions, that's fine, type them in. I'll let Sally talk about some of the webinars that SYLO Associates have got coming up that may be of interest to those listening.
Right, so next Wednesday we're holding a couple of free webinars. So for people who are either managing teams who are working from home or are working at home themselves and struggling with time management. I use the word struggling, but just recognizing that working in a home environment is really different to the office. And it's just a new environment that we're finding ourselves in. I'm conscious also that school closures are going to have an impact on how people organize their work, how that's communicated within teams. And so if you're managing teams in that situation, I think there's definitely some good advice that we can give to you, some top tips from those sessions. So you can see we've got slots in the morning and afternoon for at 9:30 and 1 o'clock for managing teams, and then 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock on time management. And we're going to set up the event so people can register through Eventbrite, and we'll share that with Kelly so that she can share it with you afterwards when we send out the recording.
Perfect. And what I would say is that earlier this week, we did a webinar where I talked about the data protection challenges of your staff working from home. And I also talked about the processing of new data in relation to the coronavirus. The webinar is available on our website, and we are looking to build up our new series of webinars with Sally, where we will be talking specifically about the different HR challenges that we hope we can train people on, and that's will be coming shortly. So what I would say is we do have another question. I can see that some people's concerns are definitely working from home, so I would suggest that Sally's webinars are something to consider joining. And I'll make sure you get those details, as well as, feel free to talk to both of us after the event, and we may be able to provide you with some advice. We've then got a quick question about from a charity about when a trustee leaves, can we leave their email address so it can still be accessed? I think what you need to make sure is that the trustee that's left doesn't have access to the email. Why would you still need access to it once they've left? There's nothing that prevents you from putting a forwarding email on. The challenge is if it's their personal email address, you've got no control over that whatsoever. So I would always recommend issuing email addresses that you have responsibility for. And I'm just going to see.
Can I? It's separate to the question that's been raised there about email access for trustees, but there are a number of systems that now hold data on volunteers in organisations. So we capture a lot of information about people. And one of the HR systems we use, Breathe, enables you to store information for staff, volunteers, contractors, and it's quite, the area of volunteer information. At the point there with you, you want to know emergency contact details and other contact information. When they leave, you want that sort of data to be just automatically archived. So I just flag that because of the question that was raised there about email addresses. Well, actually, you do hold other information against those kinds of categories of people, and there are systems that can help with that too. The system Breathe that we support, you can trial it for free, and that might be something that's of interest as well to people. If they would like me to send them details, I'm happy to do so.
For sure. And then I think it's that kind of, we've took a whistle-stop tour through managing exits of staff, both from a HR and from a data protection perspective. Here are our contact details. You've got my email address and our office telephone number. Even though we're working remotely, we can still access that. And you have SYLO Associates contact details, as well as website address. What I would simply ask is if there's anyone on the webinar at the moment that would very much want a follow-up from either myself or from Sally, if you could type it in the box who you'd want a follow-up with, we can absolutely make sure that happens. There's no obligation. You don't have to hear back from us. You will obviously be advised of future webinars. So where you do want a follow-up call, please type yes in the text box, and we'll make sure that you get the appropriate message. If there are no other questions based on the session that we have provided you with, I'd like to thank you for taking your time to listen to Sally and I talk about this. I'm sure that we'll come up with other sessions that we think could be of benefit to you. I hope you have a safe and secure rest of today and next week, and for the future. You know where we are if you have any questions and need support. Thank you. And thanks, Sally, for joining me today.
Always a pleasure, Kelly. Always a pleasure. And I thought there were some really useful questions and comments made by people that joined us today. So thank you to you as well.
Excellent. Well, I will draw that to a close. Like I said, have a safe and secure day, and hope to speak to you again, or you hear from us again soon. So thank you, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.